I just now pushed the recording button, so we will have a recording of this webinar. Dee Coaster, can you see her webcam picture? Wave, Dee. Because I'm Deborah, and I also say Dee. She's the real deal. And we are going to have this open so that you can ask questions and we can have a dialogue. And I think that will be a great way to do the webinar. So we have Honest. Does everyone, Alma, you want to say hello? Okay, we've got Alma, Bonnie, Darlene, Linda, Mickey, Dee, and myself so far. So everybody can hear us?
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, looks like we just had someone else sign in, maybe not. So Dee, do you want to get started?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I am particularly interested in the subject matter, and I come to it by way of peripherally doing the work around Batterers re-education programs for about the last 15, 20 years. So I did at one point go through the education process of becoming a Batterers treatment provider, but didn't do the internship hours. So I guess my first entryway into the topic area was I had a batterer who actually was court ordered to treatment. And so I was curious from that point on whether treatment was going to work for him or not. So that was my first entryway. And then from there, I became an advocate working in a mainstream domestic violence and sexual assault agency, you know, where we were trained and educated on the topic matter. And then lastly, I sat on a county task force for about 10, 15 years where one of my committee assignments was the Batterers Treatment Accountability Committee. So I've had the opportunity to know how Batterers treatment programming comes together, how it originated in the state, Washington State Legislature, and I was lucky enough to know some of the early treatment providers who actually created the language for the law that was passed in Washington State. So I bring that to the table for this conversation and am a little less informed about what tribal communities offer in terms of traditional Batterers intervention, or there's many names. There's Batterers treatment, Batterers intervention programs, Batterers intervention services. And so when I think one of the early things I learned from Marlon Musso was that it's really Batterers re-education as opposed to Batterers treatment, even though we have that in the title. It's a process of re-educating. If we believe and we know that domestic violence is a learned behavior, then we can unlearn that behavior. So it's a matter of re-educating batterers to not, you know, commit acts of violence against victims. So in that way, it gives our field a little bit of hope that we can reverse some of the trends that we see where violence is increasing in Indian country. So this is the second in a series for us. Our first webinar, we invited a local treatment provider who is state certified to talk about her practice and some of the loopholes that she had to jump through in order to become a state certified program. So Deborah, if you want to go to the next slide.
Sure.
So our question that we're going to tackle today is, do we want, and I'll just call them Batterers treatment programs. Do we want Batterers treatment programs to follow the state accredited model? And some of you are from different states than Washington. So I'm hoping you'll share with us what your state model is. But in Washington state, we have standards that all the programs have to follow. And in order to be state accredited, they have to fill out an application and pay a fee. And so there's a process for that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the question for us today is, do we want to follow as tribes the state accredited model, or do we want to be more culture specific in our approach and develop our own tribal models? Or do we want to think about combining the two models into a customized version? So that's some of the discussion that we're tackling in these series of webinars. So Deborah, you can go on to the next slide.
Okay.
So a Batterers treatment program, as I mentioned, in Washington state begins with the process of developing a set of standards that are required for operating as a professional service within the judicial and treatment settings in the state. So in tribal communities and some of our member communities within WomenSpirit, there's a variety of situations that exist. For some of the tribes, they contract with mainstream certified state certified agencies that provide treatment to their tribal members. That's one option or one situation. The second one is that they're in the process. They currently don't have any kind of services that are available, but are thinking about whether they want to contract with mainstream treatment providers or they want to do something in-house. So one of the things that's happened over the last few years is, for many of you who have been around victim services for many years, you know that in the past there haven't been any monies available through advocacy channels to support Batterers treatment. The two streams of funding were very separate. And advocacy money just didn't go to support Batterers treatment. It only went to victim services. What we've seen happen, the trend over the last couple of years, I'd say maybe 5 years, is that tribes now have access to different streams of funding that will allow the development of tribal domestic Batterers treatment programs. So we've seen that strict channeling, siloed effect with funding come to a point where now we can talk about getting funding to the tribes for Batterers treatments programs. Next one, Deb. So either way, as a tribal community, either you adopt the state standards as they're written, or you begin a dialogue about what kind of standards you would want that are tribally specific. I think the important takeaway on this is that there are valid reasons to have standards, whichever avenue you go down. And some of the reasons for having standards is it provides guidelines for ethical and accountable intervention systems to better protect victims and their families. So the main, guideline, the very first guideline for any Batterers treatment services or program is to put first and foremost the safety of victims. So by having some standards to follow, you can be assured that the programs that follow those standards agree and value the same foundational framework. Oops, back,
Sorry.
back,
One more,
one
huh?
more.
There we go.
And so it provides a framework for the use of Batterers intervention as part of the continuum of the CCR response to criminal behavior. So you can go on to the next one.
Okay.
So another reason for having standards is it establishes a minimal level of respectful, humane, consistent, and appropriate intervention provided to persons convicted of a domestic violence charge. And it also enhances public awareness of domestic violence issues, gives batters increased access to services, and reinforces the concept that violent behavior is unacceptable. Next slide.
Okay.
Okay, standards also assist judges and others in identifying services and service providers that are reliable, predictable, and responsive. So in your jurisdiction, your court could and should have access to a list of service providers who provide this very specialized type of treatment or re-education, and over the course of time they would have been tried and true and tested, and so that each agency or each tribal batters treatment program has a track record that you can look at in terms of how well they're doing with that particular population. And if you know anything about Batterers treatment programs, you know that the effectiveness of the service depends on who's providing it. So again, over time, the provider will have a reputation with the court and with the community about, realistically what people can expect from a Batterers treatment program. And those limitations that they may have. And then Batter treatment program or Batters intervention services must strive to promote increased safety for victims and children and other family members. So that's kind of in a nutshell why we promote the use of standards, whether it be, standards that are already defined by the state or standards that are coming out of tribal communities themselves. You can go on. So in our state, in Washington state, as I mentioned, there's an application process. I think it costs $50 to file an application. There is somebody identified by the state who's the gatekeeper of the applications and the monitoring process of the licensing. And here are just a few of the attachments that go into the process of ascertaining whether a particular program has met the minimal standards for certification. So again, it's a program that is certified. It's not an individual. So if you're familiar with the treatment model where we have therapists who act as individuals who have their own histories of education and training, and they become licensed to provide a certain type of therapy to a certain population. This is a little bit different because we are looking at certifying programs and not people or individuals. So there are some requirements that are necessary for the program to meet minimal certification standards. So some of those are within the education process, education, experience, affiliation. is the program that's applying, do they have a working relationship with the local victim service agency or local tribal coalition? What is their curriculum? You actually need a written curriculum. You need a program policy manual. You need a program brochure. You need to have a policy requiring a duty to warn statement, which is a statement that through the course of treatment, if a batterer threatens bodily harm against a victim or anyone else, that the treatment provider can notify law enforcement about that. And there may be other certain conditions that fall under that duty to warn statement that releases the confidentiality between a client and a therapist. Resumes, degrees, job descriptions are just some of the things included in a state application. Go ahead, Deb, you can go to the next one. So we had Maureen Kelly sign up. Is she on the roster, Deborah?
She's not logged in.
Okay. Well, in Washington State, Maureen Kelly is the one who works out of Department of Social and Health Services, and she's the one who's the keeper of the state certified programs. So Deborah and I met with her a few weeks ago to see how many tribal programs were actually state certified, and to sort of get the lay of the land from her. So to my knowledge, Deborah, there weren't any tribal programs that were state certified, or do you recall?
No, none that were cultural specific, no.
Okay. So here's where I'm going to reach out to our listening audience to talk a little bit about what a traditional, native traditional, tribal traditional service model might look like, or what you might want included. I think if you're listening to this webinar, you have some interest in Batterers treatment programs. You may have some experience with that at your tribal level. So I'm going to open the floor up to some discussion about what might be offered in a traditional service model. Anybody have any comments?
This is Linda, and we've had a couple of different experiences here in North Dakota at Standing Rock Reservation, or the Fort Yates community down a little past Bismarck here in the southwestern part of the state. They have a huge reservation that goes back and forth into North and South Dakota, and I can't remember how many districts they have, but they have a pretty successful program down there that is based on cultural teachings and values. And once he gets a hold, it's an older, it's an elder that does this work, and his expertise is really in addiction, and he works at the college there, but he does this just after work, and he works with both women and men because both have been convicted, and that was a little bit controversial for me. But then when I heard the things that the younger people, or the people who are being convicted, were hearing and learning about, it gave them a sense of pride and an understanding about trauma and historical trauma. And as we know, probably a lot of the perpetrators of violence were also victimized at some point in their own life, and gives them the opportunity for healing. Off of that group in Standing Rock spun a new organization that is called Wacha'agli, and what that means is bringing back the men to the circle, and having those, and a lot of that is culturally based teachings from the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota nations, which really those value systems are pretty much the same amongst all tribes. They have their story of creation, and then the different values that they had that are really universal in living in a well-balanced community, that's peaceful. And they're not just here in the United States, but in the tribal communities, but around the world. I mean, they're like a teaching, almost like a spiritual teaching. But it gave them the opportunity to do the healing work they might need to do. And also then a lot of our people don't understand their where they came from and who their people are, and all they've heard is the stereotypes that are misplaced in the media, and a lot of people buy into that. And if we don't have anybody teaching us, which can happen when we have been raised in a community or in families that might have problems with addiction or other social problems, or maybe in foster care, who knows, but things that they kind of limit the amount that we might be exposed to our culture. And there's a lot of phenomenal things that tribal communities have done, and a lot of people that have worked very hard to keep those things, including language, from dying or perishing. And so that's the difference in the model that we have here in the Dakotas. Also, there is work being done with the reentry, which can include sex offenders and people who are coming back to their communities from treatment facilities, and jails, be it city, county, or tribal, but they can be ordered to come into reentry. And when we looked at that model of reentry, I attended those meetings here in the Lake region because I was concerned about the sex offenders that were coming back and how they were monitoring them, and if there were extra provisions for the monitoring of sex offenders. So that was why I was sitting at the meeting and then listening to it, all of the services that wrapped around the person coming back into the community or into society or into the tribal community. They have services including housing, mental health, health services, addiction counseling, job service, job placement. But 80% of the people in reentry here were Native American. And of that 80%, 50% were Dakota and 50% were Ojibwe, which are two of the tribes real close to this area. So, that was, sorry.
That's okay.
That was one of the things that caught our eye. And so we developed like a PowerPoint, and that would have needed a curriculum to follow it. But I'm really busy doing this work, and I had a guy that was working with me for a while that really did a good job. We went to reentry and actually had the National American Law and Order Committee call us and put us on an advisory committee because they had never thought about that piece of it, which can make the difference for our people getting well and healing if that part is implemented. Some people, that's not going to work. Some people do need, follow up with, psychological services and medications. But some people, upon knowing that, it can make the difference in both areas, in the victim services area or arena, and then also in the batterers services, where there's an understanding developed. That's what I wanted to say, at least from North Dakota and in this area, that's what we're doing.
Great, Linda. Thank you.
So do you mind my asking, Linda, does South Dakota and North Dakota, do you have a state certification policy for non-tribal organizations?
No, not currently, because the ones that they're using in the state, which we do have Batterers treatment programs here in the state that are run through our mental health services, there is the standards that they have to follow, and in order to receive funding, they have had to be trained through the Duluth model in Minnesota.
Okay.
That's how they're allowed to get their funding, is they must have, there is no deviation in federal mandate that lets them. They have to have that training, and they have to have somebody that was trained and went through that, and they follow the curriculum, which is usually a very, very long, intense program. The Bonnie that's on the phone, is that our Bonnie Polachek?
It is.
Oh, Bonnie knows about that. She was a state coalition director, and she happens to be a TA provider and my very good friend. Bonnie, if you can speak on that, because I just know about the tribal part of it, but you know more about the Batterers treatment in North Dakota.
App Store. Updates available.
I don't know.
Are you there?
call in maybe. Maybe her computer doesn't have a mic on it.
Let's see.
But she knows about the standards and was a part of that, that process here in North Dakota. But I know that they go, the one here in the Lake region is through the Human Service Center, and the state is the one that does the referrals for that program. And they were really interested also because the high number of natives that were ordered to go there and that failed, repeatedly to complete the whatever, how many, 30 some weeks it is. We have problems with transportation, and the project is here in town. That's 11 miles, which can be a long trip for somebody who doesn't have a car. So they're being held to those, to that, but then they can't complete it. So, and it's something that was meaningful and useful for our tribal people to be able to go in something that they would understand, So,
Deborah, you can write a question to Bonnie or chat with her down there, and if she has trouble with her audio, we can read it to the group. Anybody else want to comment what their tribe is doing, or tribal communities?
Well, I was just thinking that the state model, I did send a message to Bonnie. I don't know if she sees it in the chat room. Bonnie, if you can go to the chat room. I show her as unmuted, so I was just thinking that would be good to have her, chat a little bit about that.
And is Darlene from Colville still on?
She is.
Darlene, could you talk a little bit about your Peacemakers program? Or someone else from Colville is fine.
She's on there, but I don't know if she can hear us. It says she's connected to audio. Darlene, are you there? Let me see it. Let me try this. Darlene, can you hear us?
That just flipped the PowerPoint out of whack.
Well, I tried to click to make her a presenter.
Well, I think, we have different models that tribes are utilizing, and, like I say, there's a variety of ways that either tribes are accessing or don't have access to Batterers treatment programs, or re-educational models, or culturally specific, foundation models. But one of the issues that was brought up, I think, on our last conference call was one of our members wanted to know if, us as a tribal coalition could somehow position ourselves in a way where we could determine in tribal communities what was an acceptable Batterers treatment model. So part of our exploration is around that as well, because as a tribal coalition, we have the expertise and the knowledge of our tribal communities, and can advocate for culturally specific models, perhaps better than the state can. Having said that, I would hope that any state where you have a certification process and a standards process, that tribal communities would be able to access that model if they wanted to, and could ask for an exception to the rule, or be able to spell out in a culturally appropriate way why that model should be acceptable to a state certification body. I think part of what I hear is that not all tribes are gung-ho on becoming state certified, that most of us who are in this field and in this work want to create our own ways and create our own models and not have people question that in any way, as to whether, you know, they're appropriate or effective or whatever the case may be. So wherever there exists a state process, there should always be a parallel tribal process, so that we end up with a balanced system, a system that you know, is fair and equitable between the non-traditional state service models and the tribal models. So does anybody want to talk about that a little bit?
So, Darlene, let's see, I got a message from Bonnie because we can't hear her. She says, the state standards are guidelines, as Linda said. They are mandated if an agency applies for STOP or any other state funding. And she says there has never been a funding for a certification process, but the state facilitator has given technical assistance to tribal communities to develop their own. That's awesome. Thank you, Bonnie.
That's good. So it was STOP, and what else? For STOP funds, and then there was another one.
That Linda said?
No, that Bonnie said.
No, she just said that other state funding.
Oh, for STOP and other state funding.
Right, right. And Darlene is showing as a presenter now with a clear mic, but she isn't able to speak in.
Okay, well, we'll move on from that and not put her on the spot. But some of the other tribes are doing peacemaker models, which I don't think replace batterer treatment programs. However, there is a place within the court system at Culver where the prosecutor's office can divert a case out of the court system and refer them to the Peacemakers program, where they go through a series of requirements and activities to be a part of that program. And so in some communities, it's kind of controversial whether, you know, that's okay or not okay, and what kind of protections for the safety of victims is in place, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, as many tribal communities that we have across the U.S., I'm sure there's a variety of opinions about, you know, batterers' accountability and what is the responsibility of the batterers treatment program to the courts and in reporting compliance and non-compliance, about ways to keep victims safe, to promote safety for victims and their children, and so on and so forth. So
Darlene has responded that their peacemaking program is primarily composed of tribal elders who conduct talking circle with the client. And I sent a message back asking if it was specifically used for DV offenders. And so maybe she'll respond to that.
Right. So from your networking meeting, Deborah, in Eastern Washington, you did have a positive report from the Colville prosecutor about the Peacemaker program.
Right, and their prosecutor was very positive about it, and she said she was pretty skeptical at first, but it seemed to be helping with some kind of like hardcore juveniles that are people that started as juvenile offending and committing crimes that had turned around, and she felt very positive that it was lowering the recidivism rate for Colville tribes. and that most of the people who actually completed the Peacemaker program, that they were willing and interested in continuing working with the program as a mentor for others.
But we don't know how specific it is to domestic violence.
We don't. And it's not specific only to DV or domestic violence. I know that for sure.
Okay. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay.
We talked about this when dealing with the state, and I think Bonnie answered the question that whomever the state monitor is, facilitator is, that they should be open to working with culture-specific communities and providers within those communities. So, as a coalition, as a tribal coalition, I think it's our responsibility to bring the opportunity for discussion to the field, but certainly each tribe needs to decide for themselves, what's going to work best in their community, and kind of the makeup of that. So we're positioned in a way that, we can bring information to tribal communities. We can sit down with state monitors and administrators and sort of figure out, where the distribution and access to information and services lies, and be a mediator in that respect. And also, as a tribal coalition, I wanted to be open to sponsoring batter treatment services, workshops, or educational opportunities, as well as providing victim services education for the field as well too. So there's a lot of information about whether a program is being effective in stopping the violence, that a perpetrator is putting on a victim. There's all kinds of measuring points throughout a 2-year program or a 1-year program, whatever that is. And of course, that's the final goal, is that the violence stops. And we know that every time a victim, and a perpetrator end up in the system, the victim's primary goal is that the violence stops. So this is just one other tool in our toolkit, and it's an important part of coordinated community response, because you really can't have a coordinated community response if you don't have a batterers treatment program or batterers intervention services or something. So that's the information that I have. I could go into some key areas to look for if you are trying to decide whether this type of treatment is actually working with a batterer. I could take the time to do that, or we can open the comments back up to the audience.
Okay, so before we do that, Darlene did respond via the chat room. She says that there are about 50 tribally court referred clients can come in on their own in their peacemaking program. The clients must attend weekly PMC and then do family history and cultural activities to learn the tribal customs and learn values to change their behavior. The client must also present what their situation is and what they believe they can get from the PMC and how they will maintain sobriety, abstain from use or abuse of alcohol, drugs, and take a deep look at the self and worth. So thank you very much, Darlene, for adding that.
I probably drifted off there a little bit, Deborah. Did she talk about victim safety?
She did not mention that. Let's see. She says, Several of the DV clients develop a connection to the elders and learn to reconnect to their families. So there are some specific to domestic violence.
Okay, is there anybody else listening that we have not heard for that would like to chime in? Are there any questions that we can answer for you?
Okay.
Well, just before we sign off, let me just go through this handout I have, and it talks about what needs to happen in order to change behavior. And that's kind of the end goal, is that the violent behavior will stop. So when a batterer goes into some kind of treatment or re-education program, this should be some of the considerations. And this is from Lundy Bancroft, and he wrote a book about why does he do that. Accepts consequences for battering behaviors is one. Enters into a re-education program, we talked about that. Accepts confrontation about the violence and abuse towards others. Is held and accepts avenues of accountability for the battering and claims full responsibility in the battering. So we know that out the gate, the first thing that batterers do is they claim no responsibility for their behavior and they blame the victim totally. So these are some indicators that there's been a process of change in thinking and behavior when becoming exposed to a program or having gone through a program. So some other processes of that change are a full disclosure of past abuses and violence. We mentioned acceptance of the responsibility, relinquishing all excuses. I think this is an important one because many times, alcohol might be used, or childhood experiences might be used, or provocation might be used, but relinquishing all excuses. Developing empathy for the victim, I think, is another really important one because a lot of batterers cannot feel empathy for their victims. Can identify the benefit to them for changing their behaviors. In other words, something's not working in their lives, so some things really need to change. And then being able to identify the benefit to giving up the violence. Identifying patterns of coercive control and integrate non-control into behavior. So we know that one of the hallmarks of being a batterer is they need to control everything. So through a process of therapy, then coming to a place where they can give up that control. Identifying abusive attitudes, for instance, entitlement, ownership of women and children, being able to identify some of those things. And development of an empathy for kids who witness. It's taken us a long time to get to the point where we recognize that there's a detriment or a negative effect to having kids witness DV. In the old days, I can remember people would say, well, they didn't really hear it, they aren't exposed to it, they were in a different room, and we know all those things not to be true now. So developing good parenting skills. This is something that comes out as a result of going through re-education programs, is that there is actually a parenting skills component to it. This one is interesting because it's making amends without contacting the victim and without manipulation. So how that's done in a program is the clients, the batterers, are asked to write a sort of apology letter, but they don't get to send it. So in that apology letter, you know, they have to illustrate empathy. They have to not make excuses for their abusive behaviors. All of those things we've talked about. But the key is they don't get to make any kind of contact with the victim. They have to develop respectful behaviors to all women, and not to see themselves as the victim. And this happens a lot, is that batters often see themselves as the victim and somehow are provoked, you know, into bad behavior. And then a lifelong commitment to living violence free. I mean, that's the end result and the whole purpose of it. So if all of those things are met, and you know, you've sort of gone through a process of getting to know the batter, then you can evaluate, you know, how successful a treatment program has been.
Bonnie was asking, she says, you mentioned that current trends allow for new funding federally. What might those be?
I know specifically, and Linda, you can help me out with this, under the grants to tribal governments, I know of tribes that have written in monies for batter treatment programs and have been awarded. So kind of all of our tribal grants were thrown into one pot called grants to tribal governments. And though that grant stream is divided into maybe 6 or 8 or 10, I'm not sure how many divisions within that one grant application, but within that application you can fit in batters treatment programs.
Okay. Darlene also wanted to add to their peacemaking program that not only do the clients work towards reconciliation with the family and the victim to maintain peace, but they've also gone through are returning to finish GED or school and literacy skills, and also working on job skills and life skills. So it seems like the Peacemaker program in Colville is more of it's a real holistic program in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Darlene. Thank you, Bonnie, for contributing.
Thank you, Linda.
Yes. And Brenda, thank you for tuning in. We are recording this, and we will find a way to get it to you so that you can listen to it in its entirety. Anything else, Dee?
Well, does anybody else have any other questions or comments? I think for our next step as a tribal coalition, you know, operating in Washington State, we're going to be interested to know what kinds of resources, training resources the tribes would like. You know, Linda's a tribal coalition executive director as well. So, you know, our mission in life is to provide technical assistance and consultation. So whatever the tribes need from us, please let us know.
All right, that wraps up our webinar today, and I think maybe we'll have some future offerings in 2014, Dee. So we'll invite you to those as soon as we know when they're going to happen. So thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.